Hey guys! So let's 3D. This is the intro to sculpting and retopology, and we would just be discussing like the overview, the general workflow of what sculpting and retopology is essentially. So because I think these two processes are one of the two important processes that you will need to learn to be able to make detailed assets as well as assets with depth and personality to it. So let's begin. So let's begin with a quick definition of terms, because these concepts are already something that you may be familiar about, but it's really nice to have like a defining term to it to make things more real. So when modeling, there's actually two kinds of modeling. So there's the hard surface modeling, and then there's the soft surface modeling. So hard surface is essentially just making an object, an inorganic object, because when you're something that we are already super familiar about is getting a primitive shape from Blender and like adding details to it and to making like a completely different thing. So like let's say with the robot activity, that's a hard surface model. So essentially just inorganic objects. So I would also like to point out that hard surface modeling is actually easier to model than to sculpt, because on contrary, soft surface modeling is actually easier to sculpt than model. Like this is all personally speaking, because soft surface modeling are organic objects, so like characters and creatures and plants, I don't know. So yes. Moving on. So let's have a quick definition on what high poly and low poly is. I'm sure you're already familiar what these means. It's very straightforward, but one other way to describe a high poly model is that it would have more details, therefore more polygons. So when we're sculpting, we're actually making a very high poly model of our asset. So this high poly model will be used to add details to our low poly model, which I will be discussing later. And then of course we have the low poly model, which is just the game ready asset. So it's ready, it's optimized, it's lowest poly as it can be. And of course, like, because I mentioned earlier, more details means more polygons. But with our low poly, we don't want less details. That's where retopology and other stuff will come. So retopology is the process of making a low poly from your high poly. Yeah, follow me. So we're creating game ready assets from your high poly, and after we created your low poly from your high poly, we would be baking. So baking would be essentially just transferring of data, or like just flattening that data. So having copying and having these fake details. So a good example would be if we have super high poly model with a lot of wears and tears, but in our low poly it's a little bit more straightforward. We would be baking the details of our high poly into our low poly. So we would be having a game ready asset with all of the details of the high poly. Yay! So enough of that. Let's go on with the general workflow of sculpting and retopology. So these two processes are actually not the right way, not the only way, but this is the way that through trial and error, I found most efficient. So we have the low poly to high poly process and the high poly to low poly process. So for the low poly to high poly process, this is generally used when you're doing a hard surface model and you want to add like details like wear and tear and dents, like scratches and stuff. So like what I did with the Jinx gun, I went from low poly to high poly so that I could add those tiny dents and stuff. And then for our high poly to low poly, this is usually used when we're making an organic detail. Like I said earlier, when making soft surface like characters and stuff, it's generally easier to sculpt it first than model. Like it's like generally easier to sculpt than model. Like I think since we were made to model characters, you would understand how difficult it is like to visualize like the soft surface that we want to model. But if you were given the chance to actually model it like clay, it would be easier because you would have like a great visualization of it. So yes, that's when low poly to high poly usually used for hard surface modeling, and then you're adding tiny details. So you already have the low poly, and then you're adding more details. And then high poly to low poly is usually used for soft surface modeling because it would be easier to have the sculpt first before moving on to the retopology or making the low poly. Next is your high poly to low poly. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's usually used for soft surface modeling or like organic stuff where it's easier to just sculpt rather than model. So this is a complete initial high poly is really just an optional process. But if you're more familiar with 3D software rather than the sculpting, the ZBrush, like me, I usually just make the general shape of the high poly. So we would have an initial high poly with subdivision and holding edges. So similar to low poly, but this time we don't have an initial low poly. So after you sculpt it, you have the final high poly. And since we don't have the low poly in the first place, because we started with just the very general shape, like the shape of the face maybe, to start with the sculpt, that's when we would do the retopology. So we would start modeling along the high poly model. And this would be shrink wrap modifier is also another very useful modifier to add when doing retopology. Yes. So first, let's dive deeper into low poly to high poly. So again, this is usually used for hard surface modeling. So initially, you would have an initial low poly. So this would be your base model, and essentially just your hard surface model. It would have the overall shape and stuff, and then before feeding it into ZBrush, because when we feed it into ZBrush, we would have to subdivide. I'm sure you know what subdivide does. It's that it kind of shrinks the object, and we don't want that. When we want to keep the overall shape of our model before we feed it into ZBrush and start sculpting. So what I usually do is that I would make an initial high poly that is subdivided, like just go to Blender, go to modifiers and subdivide it, because it essentially emulates how it would look like when you subdivide it in ZBrush. And so you would see where it would start deforming, and you would know how to fix it. And to fix these deformations and the shrinking of your object, you would have to add holding edges. So when you're adding holding edges, it's literally what it means. So it's edges that would hold the shape of your model when you subdivide it. So after you're done with your initial HP, initial high poly, you can now start with your ZBrush. Woohoo! And then sculpt. You have your final HP, and then that's where you would have a little bit another process, because then after you sculpt, you would have this kind of deformation with your model. So it would be a little difficult to start baking if the high poly is super it's like super different from the low poly. So you would have these crazy artifacts that you don't want there. So what I usually do after I have the final HP, the sculpted model, I would make a final LP. And this is super simple because you would just shrink wrap your low poly to the high poly so that it would still follow the shape. Okay. Okay, so let's use this Jinx gun that I created a couple weeks ago as an example for our low poly to high poly process. So here you can see that I'm making the actual model, and I'm being wary of, at this point, I'm already being wary of the polygons because as I said, this would be the low poly to high poly process. So I'm making a hard surface model that I want to add details in. And then after I'm done with that, when I'm happy with the model, yeah, that looks good, I start with creating my initial high poly. So this is my initial low poly. Now I want to make my initial high poly, right? And I would begin to make my initial high poly by adding subdivisions modifier. So, ooh, banana. Wow, naming convention. Very cool. Okay, so here. I will start adding subdivision. And this is what I mean by adding holding edges. Because as you can see, the moment I added subdivision, it shrank. It's no longer the shape that I want. Here, let's add like a subdivision surface. And the moment I added a subdivision, you can see that my mesh it's shrunk. So that's why it's important to add holding edges, because I want to keep the shape of this object when I export it to ZBrush. So all you have to do is add edge loops and max it out to the very end of the edge. Literally make edges that hold the shape. See, now it's like tightened up, and I will be doing that for all of the screws, which is not an efficient use of my time. Oh, this is a better visual for like the subdivision. Like this entire thing, I copied the modifier of these bolts. I copied it into all of the objects, as you can see. And well, they got deformed, as I've said they would, because that's essentially it. Subdivision essentially kind of shrinks it and makes it more rounded, because it wants it to be smoother, right? So essentially makes it rounder. Now we have this ugly ass, look at that pointy thing. So by adding a holding edge, just like that, it's got the shape back. I will be doing that for all of the edges. Tedious, but it pays off at the end. And then let's skip to the sculpting part. So for this one, we will be starting to make our high poly model. So let's go to the very beginning of this. Oh my. Okay. No. Where is it? Okay. Now, you can see that even though we subdivided already, it's still like the polygons are still visible, right? So we would want to subdivide it again in ZBrush, and we would like a good million. 1 to 3 million is essentially the ideal if you want to really see the details. And no, it won't explode. It's actually it's designed specifically for sculpting, so it won't explode my PC. Even though mine is already a potato PC, really works well with 3 million polygons. So I'm going to I'm gonna go discuss this in a more thorough manner, but for now it's just a quick overview. So I'm gonna subdivide it. Look, I subdivide it and it holds the shape. It's still the shape, but smoother. That's because we added like holding edges. So it's really good to add those before you put them in your ZBrush. So now we are at 2 million vertices. So now when I start to sculpt, it's actually really smooth. Look, now I can add like wear and tears into my gun barrel. Okay, adding more sculpt into that. And then I have this. I'm like satisfied with this, right? Now I will be... Okay, so a quick intermission because my mom called me. And you might start to hear the washing machine in the background. But you know what? Let's keep going. So as I was saying, I was already done with my final high poly. And I want to make my final low poly because I already have the final high poly, which is the model that has tiny scratches on it. That's like a 10 million a 10 million polygon model. So I want to kind of start merging my high poly and my low poly. So okay, renaming. Okay. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh. Okay, so I completely forgot about that. Anyway. So I was setting up my low poly to my high poly. So I started to put shrink wrap modifier on my low poly and put it on my high poly so that the shape would be generally the same. So that's the thing. And then after that, all we have to do is save it separately, low poly and then on high poly, and then we start baking stuff. But then that would be for future discussions. I think, yes, that will be all for this one. Thank you. Bye.